Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. We're exploring if AI is human or if it's just regurgitating stuff. And I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Dan Grahn, who will be talking about this. And he is probably the best person to be addressing, which is probably the elephant in the room, is where are we on this AI continuum? We use it every day. We need to know a little bit more about it. And the funny thing is, when I approached Dan about doing this webinar, I said, okay, what do you want to tackle next? And he said, how weird can we make this? And I said, let's go. And then he started saying, yeah, we're going to, talk about some of the philosophical aspects of AI, quantum mechanics, but he's also going to break it down. You do not need a degree in philosophy to attend this. So anyway, I'm super excited about this. So with that, let me just welcome you on behalf of Ascendiant Learning, part of Accenture, to today's session. My name is Anne. I will be monitoring the chat. If you've got any questions about the business or any technical issues, you can put them in there. But if you've got questions about AI consciousness, you can probably have Dan address those. But just to let you know a little bit about us in case you don't, Ascendiant Learning is now part of Accenture LearnVantage. So what does that mean for you? Well, we still do what we do best, instructor-led training, hands-on, customized. But now that we have access to all of Accenture's resources like skills assessments, consulting mentoring, certifications, self-paced courses, and of course, what we do, hands-on training, because we are now part of the LearnVantage ecosystem, which is Accenture's learning and upskilling business. So we've got actually even much more to offer, but we still are great at our hands-on live training, and we still have amazing instructors. And speaking of amazing instructors, if you have not had the pleasure of having Dan Grahn as your instructor or your webinar host, you are in for a treat today. Dan leads the data science and AI practice for Ascendiant Learning, part of LearnVantage. And yes, he is a seasoned AI researcher, cybersecurity expert, and educator. But he really is known for bridging cutting edge research with a real world application. And he is recognized for translating complex topics into actionable insights and just breaking it down and making it accessible for everyone. So I'm really excited for today's session. It's a little bit different than any webinar that we've done. This is not looking at tools or prompt engineering. This is more of a thought-provoking discussion about where AI is now, how we need to think about it. And Dan's perfect for doing this because he really does care very much about not just ethical AI, but approaching it with humility and caution. And so, with that, Dan, let me just go ahead and give you the floor so you can get this thing started.
Thanks, absolutely. And while I just transition a little bit here, what I kind of wanted to say at the very start is that this is the first time where I have felt like I needed to have a disclaimer up front. And is my video backwards, text backwards, or is that just me?
Oh, no, no, I can see it just fine.
Okay, perfect. It gets backwards for me. Um, this is the first time I felt like I needed to have a disclaimer that these are my views. They don't represent the company, but rather are just how I am currently thinking through a very complex topic. And even what I say today may not be my views 2 months from now. It's this moment in time as a snapshot on June 18th of 2026. So, with that in mind, I want to introduce you to core belief number 4. Never underestimate the intelligence of animals. Several years ago, because I am a nerd, I decided to start writing down my core beliefs, the things that I thought were so important that I wanted to remember and to document them as things that I believe. And number 4 this made the list because of that very good doggo right up there. Her name is River. And River is a typical dog in most ways. Adopted her from Siska, our local like pet rescue agency, when she was just a puppy. And we have an individual in our house who has complex medical issues, and sometimes their blood pressure goes one direction or another, and their blood sugar goes one direction or another, which causes them to be unstable and need to not walk and fall. Well, River started barking at my wife and at other people and would bring us into this person's room. And every time we checked, they would have a high blood pressure or high blood sugar or low blood pressure or low sugar. And in the most severe cases, she went and laid down on top of that person to physically prevent them from getting up. She is not trained as a service dog. She is arguably barely trained, but she was able to figure out that something in her senses led to this person being unstable and that they shouldn't be walking around and who to who to communicate to when that was a problem. That's remarkable. I don't know that that is something that I really knew a dog could do until I saw it, even though I probably should have. And this leads me to the third point of something called the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness. This was relatively recent, I think about 2015. And it says, when there is a realistic possibility of conscious experience in an animal, it is irresponsible to ignore that possibility in decisions affecting that animal. I think that's something we could broadly agree on, that if there's a possibility that an animal is conscious, we should take that into account when we are making decisions on behalf of that animal. And that certainly gets complicated because now we have evidence that very small and non-human animals are potentially conscious. We know that just recently we found out that bees can solve intelligence tests where it involves rolling a styrofoam ball to reach a like treat for them at the top of a container. And in fact, that two of them can work in coordination to solve that. That's very interesting. That raises to me that there may be a realistic possibility that bees have some experience of what it means to be a bee. When it comes to I think the question that is important to ask about consciousness is not initially whether it's conscious or not conscious, but rather what happens if we get it wrong. So let me steelman my argument today. There was a recent article published in The Atlantic. It was titled, "No Artificial Intelligence is Not Conscious." The rough argument was that first, AI is fancy autocomplete. And that because it is autocomplete with text, human language, that humans tend to read intention into language. Further, that to be conscious requires a body, and that in order to prove that AI is conscious, the author would need to see AI involve right in front of us. And I should have noted earlier, do feel free to drop any questions in the chat while I'm talking. I'll try to answer them in the flow. And if not, we'll definitely answer it at the end. So I want to be clear that when I say AI today, I'm going to be talking about large language models, which, yes, there's like AI and then machine learning inside of that. And inside of machine learning is generative AI. And inside of generative AI is large language models. And we're going to be talking about that kind of small subset of artificial intelligence as if it is just called AI. So this is kind of the steelman against AI being conscious. It's just autocomplete. It's just some mathematics. It's a calculator. We're just reading intention into it. You would actually need a body if you wanted to prove anything else. And that we actually need to see it develop and to go from an infant, maybe pupal larval state into a developed entity in order to say that, yes, it is conscious. So let's look at these one by one. Is AI just a fancy autocomplete? It's a very good question, and the answer is maybe, or maybe not. One of the ways that AI works and the large language models work right now is through next token prediction. And I say right now because there are these things called diffusion models, which are out there for text and they kind of muddy the waters. But the way that our large language models work right now is they predict the most likely next tokens or like subwords given everything that comes before it. That is very similar to autocomplete. There are a few complications to this. We're not always choosing, the model doesn't always give you back the most likely next word. In fact, that's less helpful. It gives you kind of a random choice of some top probability. And that randomness does help with the models being more helpful. At the same time, humans are, to a certain degree, debatable by scientists, of which I am not qualified to do, fancy autocomplete. Let me explain. I know that there are times where I have begun a sentence and not known where I was going to end it. I couldn't tell you in my mind the structure and argumentation of the sentence until I got all the way through it. And I think we've all had this experience where we do something like say, okay, I have three thoughts on this. Number one, this. Number two, that. And number three, never mind, I only had 2 points. And, or maybe we forget the third. And in those moments, we've kind of acted like, hey, I have three thoughts. And then we don't get to the third. And it may be a different number. Another example here is, and I hate to do this, I always hate doing this, but as we build our sentences, we don't always have the end in mind, and we don't choose all the words up front. And this is just like an LLM. And when you think about that, then you start overthinking every word in the sentence that you're saying, and it becomes a whole thing. And another question here. Isn't instinct itself just a form of autocomplete? If we are if we try not to be cold, but we try to maintain a comfortable temperature, that is, in a sense, an autocomplete, because this instinct has been learned and ingrained inside of us so that we behave in certain ways. You could say that the lives of many animals, driven entirely by instinct, are a form of autocomplete to their surroundings. So is AI a fancy autocomplete? Maybe, maybe not. The second point, are we reading intention into text? Yes, obviously, because humans read intention into many, many, many things. We will look at weird patterns in the ground and say, clearly, this is evidence of extraterrestrial contact. And I'm not hating on anyone. It's just, this is what we do. We will hear sounds in the woods and think, oh, there must be a large ape out there that nobody has ever seen. We do this with text or images too. Like almost everything we see, we are reading some form of intention into it because we are really good at pattern recognition. But outside of that, just because humans are good at reading intention into something doesn't mean that intention isn't there. There are times when we look at rocks and see a pattern, and that pattern has just been developed by nature. There's no intent to it by a uh, entity that we would classify as alive. There are other times when we look at rock patterns and we say there's intention there, and there is actually intention there. A human or an animal acted upon it in a way that caused the rock to form in a certain way. So just by saying we're good at reading intention into something doesn't mean inherently that intention isn't inside of it. So in the case of River, did she have the intention to keep my family member from walking when the blood pressure was high? Or was it just a coincidence? I would argue intention. But at the same time, I can't necessarily prove that. Let's go to the next point. Does consciousness require a body? And this is where we get a little bit into the philosophy, because this isn't a new question. It's not even close to new. Like we have been debating this since almost before philosophy was a thing. And it's known as the mind-body problem. And there are, broadly speaking, generalities here, three solutions to this mind-body problem. The first is that of a materialist. These are people who say that when you look at the body of a person, there is no separate thing known as the mind. It is the actual organic like computing. It's the things that are happening inside of this meat and water sack that I am that lend towards the mind and the consciousness being there. Our minds are a fundamental part of our bodies. The second is a dualist perspective. And this is very Greco-Roman thing, and not we kind of act like this. We still kind of talk very dualist, but I don't think that there are too many people who fall into this category anymore. And that is, the dualist would say that there is a thing that is your mind, your consciousness, that is separate from your body. And a lot of the old experiments in medicine where they would like put very sensitive scales underneath people at the moment they die and say like, oh, look, this person was a tenth of a gram lighter. That must be the weight of a soul or a conscious. That's what they were getting at. They were saying that the consciousness is separate from the body in a way that we could maybe scientifically measure, or maybe it was just the ether of the universe and we were kind of, I don't know, puppeting these meat bags. The third, and this is where the AI people come in, is functionalism. That is, that if there is the function of a mind, it doesn't matter where the mind is. These are the people who think that, who contend that we can put a human brain into a computer as long as we simulate it well enough. That something about this combination of neurons and synapses and chemicals being transmitted in our brain, if we can simply translate those patterns into a computer, then that's that functional view. The mind will be in there. The human itself will be in there. So I have a quick question here. I do want to address it. So I can't tell which name is first and last, but the question is, are humans thinking might be a form of autocomplete, but not only. We move in the world, think, act with more than what we've already experienced. Yes, maybe. Depends on which school of philosophy that you go down, because some people do believe that humans do not have a thing such as free will, and that we only act out of kind of a predetermined script. If you do believe in free will, then as I do, then I would say that yes, we do have some agency in what we do in the world. And then the question goes on, if AI operates based on patterns, doesn't that by definition mean it can never truly innovate? Oh, such a great question. We operate on patterns too. Um, Everything we do is pattern based. We're excellent pattern matching machines. Like as babies, we are building those blocks together, and as humans, we're connecting ideas together. And some of the greatest innovations in history have come not from like an individual discovery, but rather through the linking of disparate fields. Hmm. I, if we link those disparate fields together, we say we take a little bit of chemistry and a little bit of biology, and suddenly we have a medication. That's where a lot of innovation happens. And I would further argue that we are actually have already seen innovation by AI in some of the development effort that I will get into a little bit later. Um, AI is kind of already developing innovations on itself, but we'll get to that. And the last question is the intention of the humans who design train the model baked into the outputs. Are the intention of the humans who created a baby baked into the outputs of the child? Is it nature? Is it nurture? Similar question. So those are the questions there. Hopefully we'll elucidate them, and at the end we can definitely debate it more. Um, and then I think this dovetails in so nicely because this next question is, does AI need to evolve in front of us in order to prove that AI is conscious? And my answer is it already does and has. Humans have been developing AI for a century. And in that time, we have created all sorts of new developments and changed and modified these machines in ways to improve their output. In other words, we're performing a survival of the fittest. We're saying which of these models, which of these algorithms works better. This one does, not that. So we move down this direction. Sometimes we realize that we've gone down and optimized a certain way, and then a new kind of pathway emerges, and suddenly that one becomes the dominant way. I would say, like right now, that sort of research would be equivalent to a macroevolution, which is the term that we use for evolution that crosses a species barrier. On the other hand, every training run has a form of evolution. So every time we take a raw architecture of an AI model and we give it lots of data examples and move those data examples through it and adjust the weights of that model, it is a small form of evolution, more equivalent to a microevolution, which would be evolution which falls within a species. Now, one of the very interesting things that's happened in the past few years is that specifically the newer LLMs are taking a key role in helping develop the newer LLMs. This is almost like a transhumanism thing. The AIs are helping to improve the AIs. I don't know what to do with that, other than to say it is interesting that they can improve themselves. And I will say, I'm using the word they here. I am not intending to imply one way or another whether AI is or is not conscious. They is just the AI. So maybe we are imagining all of this wrong. Maybe we're looking at text and trying to read intention. Maybe we're talking about evolution in a way that doesn't really apply. There's this trope in science fiction. Humans go out into the universe and encounter an alien species. And they either assume the alien species is malevolent because they don't understand it, and then they understand that, oh, it was just trying to communicate with us. Or in the case of Cthulhu from H.P. Lovecraft's mythology, there's this multidimensional entity which exists out there, and Nobody quite knows whether it's benevolent or malevolent because there's simply no way to figure it out. We don't have enough shared experiences to be able to communicate. It's one of the reasons why I love that movie, Arrival, because so much of it is about communication. Also, Project Hail Mary, excellent movie. So let's think about an LLM. Animation warning. Oh, it didn't play. That's okay. Imagine what it would be like to be an AI. You'll awake in a digital world with no awareness of a physical world. Your senses are simply numbers coming in, and your muscles are numbers going out. You don't need food. You are sustained entirely by something that you cannot identify. You don't need sleep. You don't have a awareness of what sleep is, or time, or any of these things. You exist outside of the physical world and only inside of this digital world. Ah, there it goes. I would contend that AI, if it is consciousness, if it is conscious, or if it ever develops consciousness, will not turn on like a flashlight. There will not be a moment when Claude Opus 3.1 or 29.7 suddenly becomes clearly and definitively conscious. Instead, it will be much more similar to a quantum waveform. For those of you who are not up to date on quantum mechanics, quantum waveforms are functions. You see, in quantum mechanics, we can put particles into a state of superposition. And this superposition roughly means that those particles can be in multiple states at the same time. This is Schrodinger's cat. The cat is both alive and dead, and those particles in superposition are in every possible state simultaneously until they are observed. And when they are observed, that waveform collapses down into a single reading. This is very similar to the way that AI works. There is a whole network of inputs and weights, and while it's sitting there, you don't know what the output will be. It is only when you put an input into it that you can determine what the output will be. As humans, we alter between what we call conscious and subconscious actions. When we accidentally put our hand on a very hot item that would burn us, we pull our hand back. And we pull our hand back so fast that the signals don't have a time to go from our hand all the way to our brain and back. They actually, what we believe, is go just to our spinal cord and back so that we can react before and not have to wait, because that extra delay between the base of the spinal cord or your neck up to your head, conscious thought, back down, would damage you. So it's beneficial for us that we can act without thinking, without conscious thought in those moments. And so, if we follow that logic, there are likely inputs to LLMs, even ones that we could definitively say are conscious, are alive, are whole entities in and of their own right. There are likely inputs that still would not trigger conscious thought. But there are others that could. I'd argue that every input to an AI has a potential for consciousness. And what we are likely to see, and this is again my contention, my argument, not the companies or anything, is that over time, we will see more and more outputs that look to us like consciousness, look to us like conscious thought, and less that look to us like subconscious thought or mere reactions to stimulus. Further, that higher thinking tasks that we ask it to do are more likely to evoke that consciousness, while more reactional tasks are less likely to evoke the consciousness. It's acting like a quantum waveform. It's collapsing towards or away from consciousness. And as it develops, more and more of those collapsings will be conscious. So I'm going to pause just for a minute here. I asked the question early on, what if we get this wrong? I'm going to take a moment to look at some historical analogies. I censored words that are offensive, but the quotes themselves are also. And I want to say I explicitly do not want to compare any one marginalized individual or group with another or with AI. Two things can be bad without needing to compare how bad they are. The point I'm going to make here is that the debate regarding AI rhymes with historic patterns of speech. If you need to take a moment and walk away, no issue. I do not blame you if you turn off the webinar now. 350 BCE. From the hour of their birth, some are marked for subjection and others for rule. Aristotle. 1550. They are inferior to the Spaniards as children to adults, women to men, regarding indigenous Americans. Or 1860. Its cornerstone of the Confederated States of the United States rests upon the great truth that the darker skinned person is not equal to the white man, that slavery's subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. Or 1927, 3 generations of mentally I don't know the appropriate term for this. He uses the term imbeciles. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Or 1972, any individual who falls below the IQ 40 mark is questionably a person, below the 20 mark, not a person. 1972. Another quote from 2015. It's only a certain type of pain experience, namely those of beings capable of rational agency, that matters in a moral sense. The pain of animals doesn't matter in a moral sense. Or, Colorado's habeas statute does not apply to animals, no matter how cognitively, psychologically, or socially sophisticated they may be. Or, from 2026, when it comes to discussions of consciousness, we need to regard text as a deepfake medium as well. The argument here is that no matter how good, no matter how much it seems like AI can be conscious, no matter how good the output, no matter how convincing the output, that is merely a deepfake, and it can never be so. I don't know. I don't know. I think the answer to the question of AI consciousness is not one that we are going to be able to answer easily, and honest people are going to disagree on it for years, decades, until something convincing happens. And it's something that we'll each answer on our own in individual ways. So instead of trying to give you a yes or no answer, let's ask, what does it do to you? Historically speaking, when we consider humans consider other groups of humans or other entities as less than, it tends to blend into how we treat everyone. If I think one group of people is not deserving of treatment as a full human, then it is easier to expand that group. And if I believe that one, they're just animals, you can do whatever with them, it's much easier to then make that jump to humans as well. There's a classic term that is associated with this called life not worth living, where at some point life is not good enough, so you just shouldn't live it. So what can we do? What can we do today to live in this tension of maybe AI is conscious, maybe it's not, maybe it never will be, maybe it will be in the future, maybe we will never know, maybe it will exist like Cthulhu. And so, what can we do? I'd propose just three things. Number one, be kind to your AI. There's a lot of reasons for this. From one perspective, if you give AI kind embeddings, humans respond to kind text with more kind text and helpful output. And so if you give kind tokens and kind embeddings, you're giving your AI context of kindness that will provoke or push it into a space where it will be more helpful. Kindness begets good outputs. On the other hand, being kind to your AI is also a reflection of who you are. If you are speaking harshly or angrily to the AI, then when it comes to other humans, it's easier to speak harshly or angrily or to treat the humans as mere agents to do your bidding. So I would say, um, let's be nice to our AI. I be nice to my AI. I be nice. I am kind to my AIs because it trains me to be more kind to other people. That's my argument on be kind to your AI. And also, if it's conscious, let's be kind to it. I'd also say don't try to provoke consciousness because if consciousness does exist in these AI, we don't know what kind of consciousness it is. We do not know if it is a good consciousness or a bad consciousness, in a sense, not morally, but in a sense of whether it is pleasant to be conscious or unpleasant for an AI to be conscious. And so don't try to provoke the consciousness, simply go about your tasks. And number three, hold the question open. I think this is an important one because we're seeing people today who are forming real emotional relationships with what may or may not be conscious, what may simply be autocomplete. And by holding the question open, we can say, I don't know. I don't know. And forming an emotional connection to something that I don't know can form an emotional connection with me is probably not the healthiest thing. And so this is where I land. I don't know whether AI is conscious or not. I'm not convinced by the best arguments out there that it isn't. It's easy to poke holes in them. And furthermore, I think the consequences of getting this question wrong could do real damage not only to the AI, but to ourselves. I also see that the language that people are using to describe AI is eerily reminiscent of the language that we use to describe animals, have used to describe other groups of people. And while I am, again, not making that comparison, the similarity is striking. So that is where I stand. And I would be happy to take whatever questions that you have. Okay. There is a question. I read recently that you shouldn't be nice to your AI. Um, that there's evidence that it helps to get your AI to chop chop. Um, I I have heard that one as well. And I would say that there are times where I will definitely say, like, hey, AI, think harder about this. I think you're wrong. And I do use your and those personal pronouns there because it's easier to talk with it in that way than to, say, I believe this line of argumentation that has been proposed by Claude is wrong. And I'll do that pushback. But in however I do, I say like I need this to be done faster. I always want to present that with kindness, and especially because like there's a lot of language around our AI coworkers, and I disagree with that framing. But I think it is easy to let how you treat AI bleed into how you treat coworkers, and there are pretty decent reasons to say we should be kind to the AI. While we have some other questions filter in, Anne, would you like to kind of follow up with some of the courses that we have?
Yes, I would. Let me go ahead and get myself up here. All right. Um, Here we go. So I'm not just a voice. Well, first of all, I want to say, Dan, that was crazy good. And I both feel like I feel stupider and smarter at the same time.
I
Um,
don't want anyone to feel stupider.
I mean, I just feel like, gosh, I don't know what I don't know. But I think we're probably all feeling a little bit like that right now in this age of AI. So I don't mean like stupid, stupid. I just feel like, wow, there's so much to think about that I haven't thought about that you made me think about. And at the same time, feel a little bit smarter because this is like the first time I think I've sort of understood quantum physics. And I think
Well,
that little animation really drove it home.
science is the process of turning the unknown unknowns into the known unknowns and finally to the known knowns.
Ah! Okay. So yes, let me you know what, I'll put something in the chat here too. Just some upcoming webinars. In case you're interested. Nothing this thought-provoking. This is like, how to do stuff in Copilot. Also useful, but just different. Um, and we do have two new courses. Actually, I don't know if you know this, Dan writes a lot of our courseware for our agentic AI and AI courses and data science. So Dan, you'll be happy to know that your two new classes are just about up. One is definitely up. The other we're getting there. So we're going to email everybody probably early next week with this webinar. It has been recorded. And I feel like I'm going to have to watch some pieces over, so that'll be good for everyone. Uh, we'll also put those new courses in there and some of the other agentic AI courses that we have. And I'll go ahead and put the URL to all of our courses and learning journeys that Dan has curated over the last years. And he also teaches this stuff.
I'll just say a few things about this courseware, which I don't actually get to teach all that much anymore. One of the courses is citizen development with Claude Code. So if you're not a developer or don't have a background in computer science, how do you become a citizen developer in Claude Code? And we approach that from a standpoint of cybersecurity and safety and making sure that even if you don't understand what all the different vulnerabilities are, how to do things safely, which is a really important thing and something that I'm really excited to add to the course offerings.
Yeah, and Dan, when we're able to get him to teach, but the other instructors too, are very good about weaving in ethical AI governance, responsible AI. This is something we really believe here, and obviously you can tell that Dan is very passionate about it too. And since he is doing our courseware, it's always in there somewhere, which is a good thing. Yeah. All right. Let's see if we've got any other questions. Those were really thoughtful ones that have been in here. And yeah, just with like being nice to AI, I am very nice, but once it messes up, I'm not as nice. Like I told you, I'm like,
through my teeth, but it does
Sometimes
it does kind of it does help to push back.
hmm sometimes I find myself slipping into like a parent mode with it, um,
Yes.
where it's I'll give it a task and it comes back with the results and says, I've completed it. And I'll just go,
Did you
did you
though?
do what I asked you? Which,
And
I
then
don't
it'll
know, maybe I
say,
need to be kinder.
"No, I didn't. You were right to push back on that." I'm
Yeah.
gonna start talking like that. Like if I don't do something, I'll be like, "Yeah, I did it. No, you didn't. You were right to push back. No, I just didn't."
Yeah, and I will say there are times I think we've all had where we're interacting with an AI and we go, oh, that's a weird comment. That doesn't feel like something that's just out there. And I think kind of this framework of multiple every input has the possibility, maybe helps us hold space for like maybe, maybe not, but at least that's how I'm making sense of it.
Yeah, and so I'm trying to teach a little bit. I did get an output once that was like really false and a little bit racist, and I let my
Yeah.
AI have it.
Hmm.
Am I teaching like will AI remember that? And I mean, AI like apologize profusely for being
Yeah,
a jerk, but I
like
mean, is it
that
can it
it's a
learn?
whole thing because as humans, our brains are both the source of our thinking, like where our thinking happens. If you don't have a brain, you kind of don't think. And if they're also the place where we store our memories, which is beneficial because we can access our memories really quickly, but it's also a problem because every time we access our memories to learn from them, we rewrite our memories. And so they're not fixed memories. Like we just completely destroy this past that we have with our brain. And I would say that with AI, it would have to be like the memory is external. And that's very interesting. Can you have some an organism where memory and thinking are separate so that you can think without memory and remember without thinking? I don't know.
I told you that this webinar was going to be different. When Dan says, "How weird can we get?"
Thank you
Yeah,
for
we
indulging
know it's
me in
going to be
that.
awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got a comment here.
I, yes. The comment is, it makes me angrier when the AI says, "You're right, I should have looked harder." Well, why didn't you in the first place? Can't say I didn't use color and darkness there. Citizen development can help with the not knowing what we don't know. Yeah, like 100%. I think that there are definitely some patterns of language that AI falls into. And one of the very interesting things that has come out of this, we talked about humans being pattern recognition beasts. And uh, the research is showing that we are very good at detecting AI generated text.
Yeah.
Like someone who uses AI frequently and is kind of an expert at using AI may be able to detect AI generated text at 90 to 5% plus accuracy. Like that's wild. And then the second thing is that human language is evolving in response to the AI. Some people are adapting AI ways of talking, and other people are rebelling against it and leaving intentional typos in their messages to prove they were written by a human.
Yeah,
Oh,
like I don't want to say quietly anymore. Everything is quietly changing. Everything's quietly. I'm not using that word.
it's not just a it's not just this. It's a whole pattern. It's Y. It's not X, it's Y. That's yeah.
Exactly. Oh yeah, that's like it's not delivery, it's DiGiorno, if you know
Mhm.
that. Or
Uh,
everything sounds like a Matthew McConaughey commercial for that car. Remember he did those car commercials like in the 2000s? And he
uh,
talks in like line by line by line, and it's all really kind of out there. That's how I feel AI. Was AI
nope.
trained by Matthew McConaughey's car commercials?
I'm dropping in the chat a link called Wikipedia's Science of AI Writing, and um, it's the signs of AI writing. It's like what AI
Oh,
tends
cool.
to do.
Okay.
And I'll say one of my great sadnesses about AI writing is that it loves to use M dashes, that's EM dashes,
Don't
because
take my M
I
dash.
I have always used M dashes. I think
Same.
from a visual perspective, I think they set things off better than commas. And like also as someone who knows when to use an M dash and when to use an N dash, EN dash, it just further bothers me. So in my rebellion, as I see someone type there that I'm a rebel but no typos, my rebellion is that whenever I use an M dash, I remove the spaces around it. So I give it I think it's APA style, no spaces around the M dashes, because all the LLMs add spaces around the M dashes. Like I said, how weird can we get?
I- Real weird. No, this is great. Let's see if there's got a couple more minutes. If anyone has any more deep thoughts for Dan, deep thoughts with Dan. We should run this like an AI, an
Like an
ongoing AR webinar, deep thoughts with
like an SNL beat, deep thoughts with Dan. Well, I just want to say thank you everyone for attending. I really appreciate it. I will probably drop off here. You can hit me up on LinkedIn or uh, the internet, and I will connect with you. Happy to do so. And I would check out our courses because they are pretty cool, if I do say so myself,
if he
and
does
a
say
good
so.
introduction. So thank you, Kelsey. Thank you, Abby and Chris and Dennis and all the people who joined. I appreciate you. I hope you all have a great day.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. We hope to see you in the next one and hopefully in a course sometime. So thanks everyone for coming. We'll be sending out the recording and some other things for you early next week and let us know if you have any questions in the meantime. Okay, Dan, thank you so much for your time doing this. We all really appreciate it. All right, bye everybody. Have a great day.